The translator's hidden world. Maria Santos had always believed that words were her greatest weapon. Working as a freelance translator in the bustling city of San, she spent her days converting documents from Spanish to English, helping immigrants navigate the complex world of American bureaucracy. Her small apartment above the corner bakery was filled with dictionaries, language books, and stacks of translation work that never seemed to end. What most people didn't know about Maria was that her linguistic skills extended far beyond simple document translation. She spoke 7 languages fluently and could understand fragments of a dozen more. This rare gift had caught the attention of certain government agencies who occasionally contracted her for more sensitive work. Maria preferred to keep this part of her life separate from her regular clients who came seeking help with citizenship papers and medical documents. On a humid Tuesday morning in September, Maria received an encrypted email that would change everything. The message was brief and came from a contact she had worked with before at a federal intelligence agency. They needed her immediate assistance with an urgent translation project. The pay was substantial, and the timeline was tight. Maria accepted without hesitation, not knowing that this decision would thrust her into the most dangerous situation of her life. The assignment seemed routine at first. Maria was provided with intercepted communications written in a dialect of Arabic that few translators could properly decode. The messages appeared to be discussing shipments and meeting locations, typical of smuggling operations that federal agencies monitored regularly. Maria worked methodically through the documents, her trained eye picking up nuances that automated translation programs would miss entirely. As she delved deeper into the translations, Maria began to notice patterns that troubled her. The communications weren't about drugs or human trafficking as she had initially assumed. Instead, they detailed plans for coordinated attacks on military installations across the southwestern United States. The level of detail was alarming, including specific information about security protocols, guard rotations, and vulnerable entry points that could only have been obtained through extensive surveillance or inside information. Maria's hands trembled as she completed the final translation. The documents revealed a sophisticated network of operatives who had been gathering intelligence for months. The planned attacks were scheduled to begin in just 3 days, during a military training exercise that would leave several bases temporarily vulnerable. She immediately contacted her government liaison, but when she tried calling the number she had always used, she discovered it had been disconnected. Panic began to set in as Maria realized she might be the only person who fully understood the scope of the threat. She tried reaching out through other channels, but her emails bounced back, and alternative phone numbers led to automated messages claiming the departments she was trying to reach didn't exist. It became increasingly clear that something had gone terribly wrong with the operation, and Maria found herself in possession of information that could prevent a catastrophic attack with no way to deliver it to the proper authorities. Late that evening, as Maria sat in her apartment trying to decide her next move, she heard footsteps on the fire escape outside her window. The building was old, and she had grown accustomed to the various sounds it made, but these footsteps were deliberate and measured. Someone was climbing toward her third-floor apartment with obvious intent. Maria quickly gathered the translated documents and her laptop, stuffing them into a backpack along with essential items. The footsteps stopped outside her window, and Maria could see the shadow of a figure testing the window lock. She had perhaps 30 seconds before they gained entry. Moving as quietly as possible, she slipped out of her apartment and down the back stairs, emerging into the alley behind the bakery. The smell of fresh bread that usually comforted her now seemed like a marker of everything normal and safe that she was leaving behind. Maria's car was parked 2 blocks away, but she knew that if someone had found her apartment, they likely knew about her vehicle as well. Instead, she made her way to the nearby bus station, keeping to the shadows and avoiding the main streets. Her heart pounded as she considered her options. The translated documents contained information that could save lives, but she had no way to verify who she could trust within the government agencies that had originally hired her. As she waited for the next bus heading toward the military district, Maria noticed a man in a dark jacket watching her from across the station. When she moved to a different bench, he adjusted his position to maintain visual contact. Maria realized that whoever was after her had more resources than she had initially thought. They weren't just trying to silence her. They were actively hunting her with a coordinated effort that suggested significant backing. The bus arrived, and Maria boarded along with a handful of other late-night travelers. As the vehicle pulled away from the station, she saw the man in the dark jacket speaking urgently into a phone while watching the bus depart. Maria knew she had bought herself time, but not much. Whoever was behind this operation would be waiting for her at the next logical destination. She needed help, and she needed it from someone who could understand the gravity of the situation without being part of the compromised system. Looking out the window at the passing cityscape, Maria made a decision that went against every instinct for self-preservation she possessed. Instead of running or hiding, she would find a way to get the translated intelligence to someone who could act on it. The planned attacks were still 2 days away, giving her a narrow window to prevent a disaster that could claim hundreds of lives. She just had to survive long enough to find the right person to trust with information that had already cost her everything she thought she knew about safety and security. As the bus headed toward the outskirts of the city, Maria began planning her next moves. She would need to find someone with military connections who could verify the authenticity of the intelligence and take appropriate action. The translated documents in her backpack represented both her greatest asset and her most dangerous liability. Everything depended on finding the right person before her pursuers could find her, the Army Ranger's unexpected mission. Staff Sergeant Jake was enjoying his first week of leave in 8 months when his peaceful morning run was interrupted by a desperate woman clutching a backpack and looking over her shoulder every few seconds. He had completed his usual 5-mile route through the park near Fort Sam Houston and was cooling down when he noticed her sitting on a bench, clearly agitated and scanning the area as if expecting trouble. Jake's training had taught him to observe details that most people missed, and several things about this woman caught his attention. Her clothing was rumpled but expensive, suggesting she had left somewhere in a hurry. Her sneakers were new and clearly not designed for running, yet she was sweating as if she had been moving quickly. Most telling was the way she held her backpack protectively against her chest, and the manner in which her eyes constantly surveyed potential escape routes. When Maria first approached Jake, she had planned to ask for directions to the nearest military police office. But something about his bearing and the confidence in his posture made her reconsider her approach. She had spent the entire bus ride trying to figure out how to identify someone she could trust, and this man's obvious military background combined with his alertness suggested he might be exactly what she needed. Jake listened carefully as Maria introduced herself and explained that she needed to speak with someone in authority about a security threat. He had encountered enough desperate people during his deployments to recognize genuine fear, and this woman was genuinely terrified. When she mentioned having translated intelligence about planned attacks on military installations, Jake's demeanor shifted from polite attention to focused concern. The story Maria told seemed almost too incredible to believe. She explained how she had been contracted to translate intercepted communications, only to discover they detailed coordinated attacks planned for the following day. When she tried to report her findings through proper channels, she found herself cut off from her government contacts and pursued by people who clearly wanted to prevent her from sharing what she had learned. Jake's initial skepticism began to fade as Maria provided specific details that only someone with legitimate access to classified intelligence would know. She mentioned code names, operational procedures, and geographic references that aligned with his own knowledge of military security protocols. More convincingly, she accurately described the current training exercises that were scheduled to reduce security at several installations in the region. When Maria opened her laptop and showed Jake the original documents alongside her translations, he recognized immediately that this was authentic intelligence. The formatting, classification markings, and communication protocols all indicated genuine intercepted materials. More alarming was the level of detail about military installations, including information about security vulnerabilities that suggested the attackers had inside knowledge or had conducted extensive reconnaissance. Jake faced a difficult decision. His leave status meant he had no official authority to act on this intelligence, but the timeline Maria described left no room for lengthy verification processes. The attacks were scheduled to begin during the next day's training exercise, which would leave 3 major installations operating with reduced security protocols. If Maria's translations were accurate, hundreds of military personnel and civilian contractors could be at risk. The first challenge was determining whether Maria's government contacts had been compromised or if the breakdown in communication was part of a larger security breach. Jake used his own channels to make discreet inquiries, but the responses he received were troubling. Several of the agencies Maria had mentioned having any record of her contract work, and attempts to verify her security clearance yielded contradictory information. While Jake worked to verify Maria's credentials, they became aware that they were being watched. A van had been parked across from the coffee shop where they were working for over an hour, and Jake had noticed the same two men walking past the window multiple times. His combat experience had taught him to trust his instincts about surveillance, and every indication suggested they had been located by whoever was pursuing Maria. Jake made a quick assessment of their situation and decided they needed to move immediately. Using his knowledge of the local area and military protocols, he guided Maria through a series of moves designed to lose their surveillance while keeping them within reach of the military installation, where he hoped to find someone who could act on the intelligence they carried. The chase that followed tested both Jake's tactical training and Maria's determination to see her mission through. Their pursuers were well organized and seemed to have resources that allowed them to coordinate multiple teams across the city. Jake began to suspect that the threat Maria had uncovered was more significant than either of them had initially realized, and that the people trying to stop them were willing to use extreme measures to prevent the intelligence from reaching military authorities. As they worked their way toward the base, Jake and Maria developed a partnership born of necessity and mutual respect. Jake's military training provided the tactical expertise needed to evade their pursuers, while Maria's linguistic skills and attention to detail helped them interpret additional communications they intercepted along the way. They discovered that the planned attacks were part of a larger operation designed to test military response capabilities and identify weaknesses in homeland security. The most disturbing revelation came when Maria translated a series of messages that suggested the attacks were being orchestrated by people with intimate knowledge of military operations. The level of detail about security procedures, personnel schedules, and operational protocols indicated that someone within the military structure was providing information to the attackers. This discovery explained why Maria's original government contacts had been severed and why their pursuers seemed to anticipate their movements. Jake realized that reaching the military police through conventional channels might actually put them in greater danger if the compromised personnel were still in positions of authority. Instead, he decided to contact his former commanding officer, Colonel Sarah, who was currently stationed at Fort Hood and had a reputation for integrity that extended throughout the military community. Jake trusted Colonel implicitly and knew she would take appropriate action regardless of where the investigation might lead. The challenge was reaching Colonel without alerting the people who had compromised other parts of the system. Jake and Maria needed to get close enough to Fort Hood to make contact while avoiding the surveillance network that seemed to be tracking their movements across South Texas. Time was running out, and the training exercise that would leave the installations vulnerable was scheduled to begin in less than 12 hours. As evening approached, Jake and Maria found themselves in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of San, planning what might be their final attempt to deliver the intelligence that could prevent a coordinated attack on American military facilities. They both understood that their next moves would determine whether hundreds of innocent people lived or died, and that the conspiracy they had uncovered reached into the highest levels of the organizations meant to protect national security. The final stand against betrayal. The abandoned warehouse provided Jake and Maria with temporary shelter, but both knew their pursuers would eventually track them down. Jake had spent the last hour using his military contacts to piece together a disturbing picture of corruption that reached deep into the intelligence community. Several of the agencies that had originally contracted Maria's translation services were under investigation for security breaches, and at least 3 high-ranking officials had been placed under surveillance for suspicious activities. Maria worked frantically to complete her analysis of the intercepted communications, while Jake established contact with Colonel at Fort Hood. The conversation was brief and conducted using military codes that Jake hoped would prevent their location from being compromised. Colonel confirmed that the training exercises were proceeding as scheduled and that security had indeed been reduced at the targeted installations. More importantly, she agreed to meet them at a secure location where they could transfer the intelligence without going through potentially compromised channels. The meeting point Colonel selected was a small airfield used for military transport operations about 50 miles north of San. Jake knew the facility and understood that Colonel's choice demonstrated both her recognition of the threat level and her ability to mobilize resources quickly. The airfield had multiple security protocols and would be difficult for unauthorized personnel to access, making it an ideal location for a secure handoff. As Jake and Maria prepared to leave the warehouse, they discovered that their pursuers had finally located them. Vehicle headlights appeared at both ends of the industrial complex, and Jake could see armed figures moving to surround the building. The systematic approach suggested these were not random criminals, but trained operatives with military or intelligence backgrounds. Jake realized that whoever was behind the conspiracy had committed significant resources to preventing the intelligence from reaching proper authorities. Using his combat training, Jake assessed their tactical situation and identified a narrow window of opportunity for escape. The warehouse complex included several buildings connected by overhead walkways and service tunnels that would provide concealment from the ground teams surrounding them. Jake guided Maria through a series of passages he had scouted earlier, moving toward a delivery dock where they might be able to reach Maria's car without being detected. The escape from the warehouse became a deadly game of cat and mouse that tested every aspect of Jake's military training. Their pursuers were well-equipped and professionally trained, using night vision equipment and coordinated communication to track their movements through the complex. Jake had to draw on every technique he had learned in urban combat situations to keep Maria safe, while maintaining possession of the translated documents that could prevent the planned attacks. During their flight from the warehouse, Maria made a discovery that changed their understanding of the entire situation. While reviewing the communications one final time, she found a series of messages that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. The planned attacks on military installations were designed to create a security crisis that would justify implementation of new surveillance and control measures by the same officials who were orchestrating the attacks. The revelation that they were dealing with a false flag operation raised the stakes considerably. The people pursuing them weren't just trying to prevent exposure of a terrorist plot. They were protecting a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and military leadership. Jake understood that reaching Colonel had become even more critical, as she might be one of the few people in positions of authority who could be trusted to act on intelligence that implicated her own colleagues and superiors. Jake's military vehicle, which he had retrieved from his apartment earlier in the day, proved essential for their escape from the immediate area around the warehouse. The pursuit that followed involved multiple vehicles and demonstrated a level of organization that confirmed Jake's suspicions about the resources available to their enemies. He used evasive driving techniques learned in military training, while Maria continued working to decode additional communications they had intercepted during their escape. The drive to the airfield became a race against time, as Jake and Maria tried to reach Colonel before their pursuers could intercept them, or before the planned attacks could begin. Jake maintained radio silence to avoid revealing their destination, but he could see pursuit vehicles in his mirrors that seemed to anticipate their route. The conspiracy had clearly infiltrated multiple agencies and had access to surveillance resources that made their movements predictable. When they finally reached the airfield, Jake and Maria discovered that Colonel had brought a full security detail and had prepared for the possibility that their meeting might be compromised. The Colonel had positioned snipers around the perimeter and had established multiple escape routes in case the handoff was interrupted. Her preparations demonstrated both her understanding of the threat they faced and her determination to ensure the intelligence reached people who could act on it effectively. The transfer of the translated documents to Colonel went smoothly, but the Colonel's initial review of the materials confirmed their worst fears about the scope of the conspiracy. She immediately contacted her most trusted colleagues at other installations and began implementing emergency security protocols that would prevent the planned attacks from succeeding. The false flag operation would fail because the targets would no longer be vulnerable when the attackers arrived. Colonel also took immediate steps to protect Jake and Maria from retaliation by arranging for them to be placed in protective custody until the full extent of the conspiracy could be investigated. She understood that their survival depended on exposing the entire network before the compromised officials could eliminate the witnesses who had disrupted their plans. The investigation that followed revealed a conspiracy involving more than a dozen high-ranking officials across multiple agencies who had planned to use the staged attacks to justify expanding surveillance powers and military authority over civilian populations. Maria's linguistic expertise had been crucial not only in exposing the plot, but also in identifying the communication networks that allowed investigators to track down all the participants. Jake's decision to trust Maria and act on intelligence outside normal channels had prevented what could have been a catastrophic attack on American military personnel and a significant expansion of authoritarian control over the civilian population. His military training had been essential not only for their physical survival, but also for navigating the complex political and security challenges they faced when official channels proved to be compromised. In the weeks that followed, Jake and Maria worked with federal investigators to help prosecute the conspiracy participants and reform the security protocols that had made the plot possible. Maria's translation services became instrumental in unraveling international connections to the conspiracy, while Jake's military expertise helped identify and correct the security vulnerabilities that had been exploited. The experience had transformed both their lives and created a partnership based on mutual respect and shared commitment to protecting others from similar threats. Jake returned to active duty with a new understanding of the complex security challenges facing the military, while Maria continued her translation work with a deeper appreciation for the critical role that accurate communication plays in protecting national security. They had proven that sometimes the most important battles are fought by ordinary people who refuse to ignore extraordinary dangers, and that courage and competence can overcome even the most sophisticated conspiracies when truth and justice are at stake.